Good morning. Looking a little too loud. There we go. Good morning. I am Sharon Hirsch. I have the pleasure and honor of serving as the president of Rosemont College. I'm also a graduate, so I'm totally biased. Don't ask me anything bad about Rosemont College. But it's my pleasure to welcome you here this morning for what I trust is going to be a very informative, exciting, and really passionate morning for most of us who are interested in business and social responsibility. I do want to brag a little bit. Our most recent surprise was to find out that one of our graduates of our MFA program won the 2018 Newbery Award. And recent grad, she graduated in 2016. And the Newbery book, the Newbery Award was given to her book, Hello Universe, which is about immigrant children. And so it's very much in part of Rosemont's mission and our whole mission to work more towards unity. And I have to admit that when I told this to the Board of Trustees, it was announced 2 days before our board happened to be meeting. And I said, believe it or not, that book was our graduate's senior thesis. And one of the trustees immediately said, oh dear, I hope she got an A. So, my other moment of bragging is that the Institute is now 7 years old. And we were privileged to have Dr. Preddy at the NCAA National Convention back in January. They wisely decided to make their educational sessions about ethics and athletics. And it was the Institute and Dr. Preddy who did the presentation. And I have to brag a little bit, I was there, and it was really, really good and absolutely needed. So, welcome to Rosemont College, welcome to the Institute, and this morning's really exciting events. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Alan Preddy, one of the co-directors of the Institute, to lead us through the day. Thanks.
Thank you, President Hirsch. Good morning and welcome. I'm delighted that you've chosen to spend this morning with us for this timely symposium on social responsibility and the common good. The impetus for this event came from the realization that over the course of the past several years, there have been increasing voices speaking to a new way of conceiving of the nature and purpose of business and of the relation between business and society. And although these voices are many and varied, they all seem to share the same basic premise, that is, that business as usual, in other words, business as focused solely on profit at the expense of all other considerations, is no longer tenable. And so from the integration of stakeholder models to organizational mission, to social impact practices, startups emphasizing social impact, from the concept of conscious capitalism to the concept of a benefit corporation, the understanding is that business can be used as a force for good. And so today you will hear from several voices directly engaged in such efforts. Bart Houlihan, co-founder of the local nonprofit organization B-Lab, will begin by providing us with some background on the concept of a benefit corporation, or B Corp. B Corps are for-profit companies certified by B-Lab to meet rigorous standards of social and environmental performance, accountability, and transparency. Mr. Houlihan will set the stage for our next speaker, Philadelphia Councilwoman Maria Quinones-Sanchez, who's a tireless advocate for the B Corp movement and has drafted legislation designed to help make Philly the B Corp's capital of the world. The opening hour will be followed by 3 breakout sessions, and the morning will culminate with a panel session. In your copy of Ethos, you'll have received at the registration table also a schedule that includes information on the 3 breakout sessions, including the names of the presenters, the titles, abstracts, and locations. All sessions take place either in this theater or in classrooms in this building. You'll also find inserted a brief survey that I would ask you to take a few moments to complete at the end of the symposium and return to the registration table in the lobby. And I'd also like to draw your attention to the posters in the lobby, which many of you saw before coming in. A number of business courses implemented projects tied to the symposium theme. And I encourage you to take a few minutes in between sessions to take a look at the wonderful work that our students are doing in this connection. And before we begin, finally, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our sponsors, Howard Philanthropies, the Society of the Holy Child of Jesus, Naturescapes Landscape Specialists, Garrison Printing, and WXPN. We are extremely grateful for their support. Again, thank you for joining us and enjoy the program. At this time, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. As I mentioned, Bart Houlihan is co-founder of B-Lab, again, a nonprofit organization located in Berlin that serves a global movement of people using business as a force for good. Prior to B-Lab, Bart was CFO, COO, and president of And1, a $250 million basketball footwear, apparel, and entertainment company. As the principal operator of the business, Bart joined And1 in its second year when revenues totaled just $4 million. Over the course of the next 11 years, Bart helped to finance, operate, and scale the business to $250 million in brand revenues with distribution in 85 countries worldwide. And1 undertook a leverage recapitalization in 1999 with TA Associates and eventually was sold in May 2005 to American Sporting Goods out of Irvine, California. Bart is a Henry Crown Fellow of the Aspen Institute. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Bart Houlihan.
So I'm going to use a handheld for our conversation this morning. We are going to make it a conversation. Okay, we're going to have about maybe 15 minutes of me talking at you, and then hopefully an opportunity for us to talk a little bit about this movement that I'm here to speak to you about today. The movement of companies using business as a force for good. And Alan, thank you for the introduction. I always like to start with the introduction because I think it's relevant. I think it's relevant that I'm not a nonprofit guy. Even though I run a nonprofit, I'm not a nonprofit guy. I'm not from the government sector. I'm actually an entrepreneur. And so I did indeed help to grow and scale And1. How many of you have heard of And1? Cool. All right. So for those of you who don't know And1, it was a basketball footwear and apparel company that if you took kind of Adidas or Reebok and took their basketball business and set it on the side, that was And1. All right. We were the second largest basketball business in the world at the height of our business, which was around 2003 or so. We sold in 2005. The reason why that matters is there were some really acute learnings for me at And1. One was that it was pretty clear to me that business was the most powerful man-made force in society. It also became clear to me over the course of the 11 years I was there that indeed that force could be used for good if harnessed appropriately. The third final realization was that even though it could be used as a force for good, frankly, business just isn't structured that way. There are legal requirements and cultural expectations that get in the way of companies that are trying to scale profits and purpose. And honestly, I felt that firsthand at And1. You know, we, as Alan mentioned, did do a leverage recap with TA Associates, a terrific outside investor. They were nothing but supportive, but honestly, when you're no longer playing with your own money, it gets a bit more challenging to talk about employees, community, and the environment. At about that peak of 2003, we got targeted by Nike and Adidas. They came hard after us. We were in a gross margin war for about 18 months. And the business went sideways. And I got to tell you, when the business is struggling, it's acutely difficult to continue to talk about your employees, the community, and the environment. And then perhaps at the moment that matters most, the moment of liquidity, the moment when the legacy of the business hangs in the balance, it frankly, under current corporate law, is impossible to talk about stakeholders. Because by law, at the moment of liquidity, you have to maximize return to shareholders. Now, importantly, our sale, this isn't a story of Ben and Jerry's. It's not a story of lament. We knew what we were doing. Everybody did quite well through that. You should feel no anxiety about this sale. But I will tell you that within 6 months of the sale of the company, any remaining commitment we had to community, employees, and the environment was stripped out by the new owner. They fired 90% of our employees. They got rid of our supply chain. And they eliminated all of our environmental efforts. And it felt at the back end of that experience that there had to be a better way, right? There had to be a way a company could scale, raise capital, and even sell the business and still hold on to mission or purpose. That core ingredient that was so important to the founders when the company was started. And that's what brought me to B-Lab. The idea of a better way for business. And so the focus of B-Lab, a nonprofit that we started in 2006 or so, was trying to find a better way for business. And pretty quickly, we realized that there were tens of thousands of companies that were already finding a better way for business. But perhaps we could have a broader objective, a more long-term objective, a vision of really redefining success in business. So that one day all companies compete not just to be best in the world, but best for the world. That ended up being the vision of the organization, redefining success in business so that fundamentally we change the role of business in society. Because honestly, I'm a believer in government, I'm a believer in the nonprofit sector. They are absolutely necessary, but insufficient. They're fundamentally insufficient. If we're going to address the disparity of wealth in the globe right now and the climate crisis we are all confronting, we're going to have to get the private sector engaged. Here in the US, it represents over 75% of GDP. It's where the action is. If we do not get business engaged, there is no way that government and the nonprofit sector alone can address these challenges. So that became the mission of B-Lab, changing the role of business in society. Our approach, however, is really simple. It's really straightforward. We find leaders, best-in-class companies. We shine a light on them, and then we give roads for others to follow their lead. It's that simple. Okay, the leaders, we give an identity to. We call them certified B corporations. Now I'm curious, how many of you have heard of certified B corporations before today? Oh, that's awesome. That's great. This might be the first time that I have more hands up for B Corps than AM1. That is awesome. Okay, and I don't know if that's because of the decline of AM1 or the rise of B-Lab, but we'll leave that to the side. So for those of you who don't know what a certified B corporation is, the easiest way to think about it is it's kind of like fair trade is to coffee what certified B corporations are to companies. The reason why that is meaningful is because we've taken the idea of a certification and we've elevated it. Because if you think of most of the certifications you're familiar with, organic, fair trade, lead certification, they're about a product or a practice. They're about one element of a business. Our certification is about the whole business. Okay? This is intended to make good easy. It's intended to make it easy for consumers, investors, policymakers to patronize good business. That's where we think the evolution of this movement is going, that people want to patronize good businesses, not just a good organic apple. Because you buy the organic apple, I got to tell you honestly, it doesn't tell you a damn thing about who picked it. Okay? That's why we think the conversation is really about the business level. And so the certification, we now have about 2,500 certified B corporations. I think they're in 54 or so countries, 150 different industries. They range from multi-billion-dollar companies down to sole proprietors. The commonality, they're all using business as a force for good. Some names that you would recognize: Patagonia, Eileen Fisher, Ben & Jerry's, Cabot Creamery. We have some B Corps here in the audience. I see Untours, I see Naturescapes, sorry, Sally. The truth is that this community believes that there's a higher purpose for business. And to certify, they've met a pretty extraordinary set of requirements. The first is they have to take and pass an impact assessment, an online assessment that looks at everything they do. Their impact on their workers, the community, the environment, their governance practices, and their customers. It's an incredibly challenging test that fundamentally evaluates whether a company is meeting the highest standards of social and environmental performance. Requirement 1. Requirement 2 is even more challenging. They have to change their governance to align their mission with their governance. The way to do this is they can either just rewrite their corporate governing documents. If they're an LLC, it's particularly easy. You just rewrite your membership agreement. If you're a partnership, you just rewrite your partnership agreement. But if you're a corporation, it can get complicated. You can either rewrite your articles, or even in some states, you're going to have to actually incorporate it as a new corporate form, something called a benefit corp. I'll come back to that. But the reason why that legal requirement matters is it means that the social and environmental performance evidenced through the impact assessment is built to last. It can survive new management. It can survive new money. It can even survive new ownership. And what's critical about this new legal framework is it changes shareholder primacy. It fundamentally adjusts fiduciary duty so that directors and executives must create value for the shareholders and also for society. It's a big deal. It's a systemic change. Okay? You do those two things, you can certify as a B corporation. Some others you might know outside of the United States. There's an unbelievable bank called Tritos Bank in the Netherlands. There's Natura Cosmetics down in Brazil. There's Silver Chef in Australia. It's really a quite diverse and powerful set of leaders. How are they doing? Is this working? Are we making a difference? Well, so we're about 10 years in. We started certifying B corporations in July of 2007. And remember, the theory of change here is shine a light on leaders and encourage others to follow by giving them pathways. Well, one of the pathways is that we allow any company who wants to use our impact assessment. That assessment that we use for certification, it's free, it's a public good, anybody can use it. Built in our best practice guides and case studies and improve your score tool. It's all right there online for you to use. And because of the leadership of 2,500 B corporations, there are now 70,000 companies that have used this impact assessment as a free do-it-yourself consulting tool. And I promise you, it ranges from the Fortune 50 to companies in over 150 countries. So yeah, we're beginning to move the needle at scale with those 70,000 companies. We add about 20,000 companies on the platform every year. The second way that I have some confidence that we're beginning to change the dialogue is around that legal framework that I referred to that is required for certification. Well, as I mentioned, in some cases, it's really challenging just to change your articles, because if you were challenged in a court of law, you'd lose. So we realized that in a fair number of jurisdictions, just asking companies to work on their current governance structure wasn't enough. We were going to have to create a new legally recognized corporate form. As I mentioned, something called a benefit corporation. This came to light for us about 6 years ago or so, that we were going to have to create this new legal framework. Fast forward 6 years, that law to create the benefit corporation has been passed in 38 states, including Delaware, New York, California, etc., Pennsylvania, New Jersey. That new corporate form now has over 7,000 companies who've adopted it, who are now opting in to a new legal framework that requires them to create shareholder value and stakeholder value simultaneously. Even more importantly, that law has been passed in Italy and is moving forward in another 11 countries. We anticipate by the end of this year, we'll probably have 3 more. It's been recommended by the G8. as a critical component to be added to all governments. And so we're kind of expecting over the course of the next 5 years to see the benefit core legislation passed in jurisdiction after jurisdiction after jurisdiction. And so that's kind of the summary of the work, right? We have this certification that shines a light on leaders and encourages others to follow. 2,500 of those, 70,000 companies using the impact assessment to measure, manage, and improve their social and environmental performance, and about 7,000 benefit corporations who have aligned their mission with their governance, all collectively working towards changing the role of business in society. Now, I'm sure there's a few of you here in the audience who are saying, that's kind of cool, it's kind of cute, right? Good for you. Why do I care? Well, I would tell you that, as evidenced by our gathering today, we're kind of tip of the spear of a bigger movement to use business as a force for good. And let me just give you some data backing behind the idea that this is truly a movement. 88% of global consumers now expect companies to balance societal interests with business interests. That is a massive shift, folks, a massive shift in consumer expectations. Data point number one. If you don't think that's going to impact your business, let me give you a more important data point. 84% of millennials expect that business should no longer define how much money they make, no longer define their degree of success. I want to reiterate that. 84% of millennials no longer define success of an individual by how much capital they accrue. I'll speak for myself. That is certainly not what I thought when I graduated from college 30-some odd years ago. That is a massive change in what the next generation of leaders are expecting for their lives and out of the companies they join. They are expecting both money and purpose, meaning from their work. And I tell you, I am fortunate to give a fair amount of these talks, and often I talk to a room of, call it Fortune 1000 businesses. And when I tell them about the trends in the consumer set, when I tell them $1 in $5 in the United States is now professionally managed with intention to creating something other than just return, financial return, that there is now $1 in $5 managed towards stakeholder return, social responsible investment. They kind of nod and don't really pay attention, but when I tell them about what's happening with the next generation of leaders, when I tell them about this is truly about attracting and retaining talent, everybody in the room pays attention. The last thing I want to leave you with, that not only do we have consumer data, financial data with investors, and interesting information about the next generation of talent, I would tell you these businesses that focus on not just the bottom line, but also environmental, social, and governance practices, what's often called ESG, they perform better over the long haul. The data is pretty unequivocal now, folks. This debate is over. If you look over any significant period of time, 5 years plus, companies that focus on ESG outperform their correlates. There was an analysis done, I think about 2 years ago, by Oxford University with Arabesque that looked at 200 different studies on exactly this question. 88% of those studies showed that indeed there was a positive correlation between ESG performance and long-term financial performance. Let me give you the data point that I think matters most to me. Our community is outperforming. Our community is certified B corporations. When we looked at the financial crisis, during the financial crisis, certified B corporations outperformed and survived through that crisis at a 64% higher rate. 64%. That's not a rounding error. And they tell you that they're outperforming not in spite of their commitment to community workers and the environment, but because of it. It's made them simply a more resilient business. They can survive the challenges of the ups and downs in markets to a greater degree because they have a broader focus on stakeholders. So what I leave you with is This isn't just the right thing to do, it is a better way to do business. And I would tell you at this moment in our history, at this moment of the rise of nationalism and the rise of populism and what is happening in governments across the globe, not just here in the United States, it does not matter whether you sit on the right or the left, there is one commonality. They all expect more from business. They all expect business to get more engaged in solving these challenges. And so this isn't just the right thing to do. It's not just a better way to do business. I believe today it is a moral imperative. It is required of our business leaders to get more engaged in solving these great challenges. We are a nonpartisan organization. Our legislation that has been passed 38 times, on 28 occasions it passed unanimously without a single vote in opposition. This is neither a Republican or a Democratic movement. It is a movement of people using business as a force for good. Thanks very much, guys. So I think we have about 10 minutes or so to take some questions. If anybody has any, please.
I'm curious about the capital structure of these organizations. Are they primarily stock? Is it bond? How is that structured?
Sure. So let me repeat the question for people in the back. The question is, tell me about the capital structure of the Certified B Corp movement. What do they mostly look like? So interestingly, they mostly are private companies. And the reason why they're mostly private companies is because of that legal requirement. After you've had an IPO and you have publicly traded stock, to ask your shareholders to vote to change your organization from a traditional C Corp, let's say, to a benefit corporation. Not impossible, but really challenging, right? To make that type of change, it typically requires a 2/3 supermajority vote. And so, though we do have a few public companies, most of them have actually gone from a private B corporation IPO'd to a public B corporation. Okay? But really importantly, I do want to pause on this because often the question is this going to inhibit in some way my ability to raise outside capital? And the truth is, not that we've seen. Okay? So far, we have pretty much every major VC and private equity company that you can name in Silicon Valley, on Sand Hill, or up in Boston, or in New York, or even here in our arena, they actually have invested in one or another certified B corporation. So it takes some explaining to explain the new corporate form, but it typically doesn't get in the way of finding both traditional capital, and really importantly, it opens up a vehicle for a new type of capital. There's a movement happening right now called impact investing, which is investors who are looking to create a financial return and a social return simultaneously. And B Corps resonate with them. They resonate with them because it answers an age-old problem with that type of investor. Once I exit, how do I know that the impact that I created together with the company will be maintained long-term? It's been a huge challenge, right? They put their capital in, they watch the growth of the good that they created with the capital, they need to exit the credit at one juncture or another, and when they exit, there's no way to know that that company is going to hold on to long-term the mission and purpose. B Corporation solves that for them. Thanks for the question. Other questions? Please.
Hi. I work for a social impact marketing agency, and so, and we've kind of been talking to a lot of businesses about this and about becoming B Corps and having a social impact, and it seems though there's a lot of hoops to jump through for bigger corporations. A lot of small businesses or even medium-sized businesses struggle with, how do I make an impact? Like, how can I really make a difference if it's such a small company and like not that many employees, and you know, they might not have the capital to like really make a difference in their community, or at least they feel that. How do you address that for smaller companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, I do want to acknowledge that to certify as a B Corp is hard. Okay, I'm not going to mislead anybody. It's really intentionally quite challenging. The assessment is very challenging. To get the legal framework through your board, through your investors, takes real work, real time, real investment. And so the certification isn't for everybody. Two, I tell most of the folks who show up that you're talking to who really want to engage, tell them to use the tool. That's what it's there for. It literally is a roadmap that'll always almost illuminate places where they haven't yet focused that they could create incremental impact, either through their business model or through their operations. And then finally, if you look at our community, I would say 85% of them are $50 million or less. And that community of 2,500, honestly, is being mentioned in a lot of great rooms, including the G20 and in the White House. Like, there's a lot of conversation happening about this community of leaders. And I'd remind your smaller businesses that small business is the engine of the economy in the United States, that small can be beautiful too. Please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nancy Barton. So I'm a board leader of Sustainable Business Network. Hi, I'm Colleen Bracken. I'm a board leader of the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia, which you know well. I'm also one of the founders of Conscious Capitalism here, chapter in Philadelphia. And I'm curious about the relationship between B corporations, benefit corporations, and the conscious capitalism movement, how you see it. I know how I see it and why, for me, working in all those areas really works. And I've also heard that some people feel, no, that those are different and they're in conflict in some way. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so thank you. And thank you for your work and your service. Both those organizations I'm huge fans of. We all are. Let me begin with B-Lab is the newcomer to this movement. All right, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. There have been people, including John Mackey and the conscious capitalism movement, that came way before us. And the work that we've done has only been facilitated by the great work that is happening in many different NGOs, governmental efforts, and business leaders. So I begin with, we're a very small portion of a very large movement that is also occupied by our friends at Conscious Capitalism and the Sustainable Business Network and the Bali Network globally, right? And so that's one. Two, we absolutely view Conscious Capitalism and Bali as our partner and not our competitor, without question. If you think about, and the truth is, I believe we're in a new partnership era with Conscious Capitalism. They are now recommending the use of the impact assessment on their website for everybody who's in the Conscious Capitalism Network. Jake Holm-Gilbert, who's one of our other co-founders, is speaking at the annual event this year. We just this year had John at the B Corps Champions Retreat, where he took the stage. And truthfully, there was some, we were aligned on almost everything for the last 10 years except one element, and that was around the legal framework. And the truth is, John came to join us at the Champions Retreat and talked honestly about the fact that he now is a believer in the legal framework, having lived through the Whole Foods transition, attack from shareholder activists, and ultimate sale to Amazon. And so there is a question that he asked, and we certainly believe that if Whole Foods had adopted the legal framework, that might be in a different place right now. I think we have time for one more question.
I'm not quite sure how to articulate this question, but one of the major roadblocks that I see to the success is when you're talking about impact investing and the common man trying to invest with their particular dollars in the traditional Wall Street market, and your framework to create leaders and then show framework or roadmaps how to get there. I'm curious to see if you have particular players that are creating that opportunity to lead to funds that the general population can invest in.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And so here's the good news, is the fastest growing component of the capital markets is sustainable investing. It's not even close. It is dramatically outpacing the rest of the marketplace. I think when we began this work, it was at about 2.6 trillion, and I think it's now over 7 trillion, so 7 or 8 trillion dollars that is in the sustainable investing. I can get you that exact number, but it is significantly outpaced the rest of the marketplace. And impact investing has grown dramatically, but it is one very small component of the overall sustainability investment space. The impact investors are really about, in some cases, concessionary investing, where they're looking to deploy capital into the most underserved countries, targeting the most underserved individuals with market-based solutions. It is a beautiful component of the market, and it is a small component of the market. And so I think one of the challenges that our collective community, everybody here in this space has, is we parse the investment market. We parse it into all these small groups instead of looking at a dramatic trend that anybody in this room who wants to go invest in a 401k can choose a sustainable investing portfolio with any of the major providers, Vanguard, Fidelity, State Street, any of them. They now offer a sustainable investment 401k opportunity. And so it is, frankly, in my opinion, one of the bright lights of what's happening more broadly, and frankly, it is completely critical. If we don't have the capital markets engaged in supporting businesses that want to operate this way, we'll come right back to this first question over here. Is it going to get in the way of my sale? Is it going to get in the way of my ability to scale because I can't find capital? And so I do believe it is. There's a great gathering called SOCAP that happens out in San Francisco. Oh, I think it's in October. Is it in October? Yeah. It highly recommend it. It is the aggregation of kind of the entire sustainable investment marketplace. And it's powerful what's happening right now in that overall investment space. Thank you for the question. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much, Mark Millihan, for shedding light on this important movement. I'd like now to introduce our next speaker. Councilwoman Maria Quiñones-Sanchez is a veteran activist with over 30 years of service to the city of Philadelphia, currently serving a four-year term on Philadelphia City Council. Councilwoman Sanchez has advocated tirelessly for creating and preserving family-sustaining jobs, investing in a trained and educated workforce, reducing blight and transforming vacant land, keeping families in their homes, mandating ethics and transparency in government, revitalizing neighborhood economies, reforming unsafe demolition practices, and securing the rights of women, families, and workers across the city. In 2016, she was at the forefront of legislative initiatives designed to help make Philadelphia the B Corp's capital of the world. Please join me now in welcoming Councilwoman Quiñones-Sanchez.
Good morning, good morning. I feel very inspired. Thank you, Bart. I think B-Lab is really leading the way in the discussion, and as we talk about what kind of world we want to live in, that's hugely important. I want to thank everyone for the invitation to come to Rosemont, and I want to recognize Rennie Andrews. In my last life, I helped Latino students become first generation college students, and Rosemont is such an incredible partner, so I thank the president and definitely Dr. Perti for the invitation. How can this whole movement really help transform cities like Philadelphia, where we have one of the highest poverty rates? And I want to put it in context, because I think, and as Bart was ending his presentation, is about the connectivity of what we're doing to become real transformative agents of change, right? And so, you know, from my first election, I come from a community development background, having done block-to-block organizing back in high school. And I represent one of the most challenging neighborhoods in the city of Philadelphia, and I like to tell my colleagues that if my district is doing better, all boats rise in the city of Philadelphia, right? And so and that's why for me the values espoused by people who look at this challenging way of creating a business model that could really have massive impact is hugely important. And so when you're looking at transformative change and the different toolboxes, I look at my legislative calendar or my legislative record as one of toolboxes in building bridges and and then trying to add the connectivity. So, you know, I authored the land bank legislation, and while I'm pretty frustrated that we haven't gotten up and going, the acquisition of land and maintaining the affordability of land is a huge component about what cities can look like, right? And so again, you know, going back to a values component of affordability and growth models and equitable development and diverse communities are values that I espouse. So I tell people who don't agree with me, if you don't share the value that Philadelphia could be a mixed income city, then I'm not going to debate you because we just don't share the same values, right? So we'll agree to disagree. And so the land bank is an important component of it, but also how government can either be a facilitator of a process to get people to move in that direction, and how does government policy facilitate and open opportunities. And so from day one of the things that I've done is always challenge the conventional wisdom of the role of government, right? And how do we change the methodology or the thinking of folks of every time we invest in the neighborhood, it's an expense, but when we do all these tax benefits for big corporations, it's an investment, right? So it really is a paradigm shift about what you do. So everything I've done from protecting people, I said the most important homeless prevention strategy is how do you keep people in their homes. And Philadelphia, for the most part, has been really progressive around home ownership. We're still one of the most affordable cities. We're the largest number of home ownership. We're still at 52%, although it's declined. It's where African American community has the largest number of home ownership. So we have some values. And I like to think that government has had something to do with that. So, you know, very early on, it was sort of, when I looked at my district and I looked at data sets, I looked at my delinquency rate, my home ownership rate, and those tell stories about what's going on and not going on. And when I was running for office, I was knocking on the doors of many of the small manufacturers that I saw in my neighborhood, and of course no one would talk to me. They're like, government doesn't get it, you just get it underway, you know, we're operating in a global market. And so when I went back and just listened, right? Go figure, government listening, right? And talked to, you know, the 13,000 plus manufacturing jobs that I still had in the district and others, and really learned that they operate in a global market, and the city we're so like narrow focused on this neighborhood, and we're in a global market. Philadelphia is in a global market. There's a lot of great people doing a lot of great work. And so from day one, it was sort of like, okay, what are all the toolboxes that we need? So from tax payment plans that were affordable so people can stay in their homes, which I authored, to everything that we've done around protecting the fabric of residential communities is stuff that I've championed. For those of us, again, going back to a value perspective, who think water is a right, I authored legislation where Philadelphia is leading the discussion around water affordability, and we have the most progressive tax payment plan in the country for water affordability that people are looking at. So I do think we're kind of leading the charge around that. From development and how we looked at planning and neighborhoods and commercial corridors and this manufacturing center, you know, from remapping and really using planning professionals to look at envisioning. If you're in Philadelphia, we're always talking about what we don't want, right? In neighborhoods, when you get to the neighborhood level, it's what I don't want, what I don't want. I was like, how do we change this conversation about what we want to see, how we envision new cities? And I found out that our business tax structure is one of the worst. All you have to do is Google it. And we have some of the most convoluted tax structures in the country. We're one of 4 jurisdictions that has this net profits tax. And so I took that on very early on, and the Chamber of Commerce and folks who have really been ingrained to this notion that the elimination of the gross receipts tax was the way to go, and they had spent 20 years in this, and here comes this Latina telling them, no, that's not what it is. You know, small businesses, the engine of the city, you know, the majority of their tax liability is in net profits, and we are one of 4 jurisdictions in the country that have this net profits tax that is punitive to profitability, right? And it's like, so the cost of doing business should be predictable, right? You should know what land is. You should know what your structure, what when you're putting forth a pro forma is based on all these factors, and then we have this punitive tax legislation. So I took on the Chamber of Commerce and all these folks, and I didn't win, but we were able to put forth BERT reform legislation that led to a $100,000 tax exemption on gross and net profits across the board, right? And what was interesting is not only did I do that, I made the big guys pay for it, right? Which is unheard of, right? Which is sort of like it's progressive taxation for businesses. But then on the global manufacturing piece, I looked at it, and again, listening to the manufacturing sector said, we eliminated over the course of 5 years the net profits tax for manufacturers who make things in Philadelphia but sell them in the world. Because our net profits tax at 6.5% is the difference between something penciling and not penciling, right? And again, took on all the conventional wisdom. And so I'm like, okay, we're all these toolboxes, land acquisition, community trust, all of these things, transit-oriented development. We're in the process of really looking at, I represent 10 L stops, and creating a density that's tied into affordability and trying to create a business hub. And then one of the hubs, which is the York and Dolphin Station, which is right near where Northern Liberties and Fishtown and some of the gentrification is happening. I was saying to my husband, is like, I want to keep this business corridor diverse. You know, what should I do? So my husband, who is a policy wonk, brought me home like 4 or 5 books on B Corps. He's like, this is what you have to do. And so I started reading some of the books. And then we started looking at B Corps, and I visited some tremendous B Corps in the city of Philadelphia. I was like, wow, these people, this is the world, right? Like, we should be doing this. Why aren't we doing this? There was previous legislation that was championed by our now mayor, Jim Kenney, but again, it was concentrated in this grocery receipts, which is the commercial tax. And we found that as well-intentioned as it wasn't really focused in on, again, where you can incentivize the business operations. And obviously, BLAB folks, everybody, what's beautiful if you want to become part of this BLAB movement and community, everybody's always willing to share and open up, right? And it's because you share some values, right? This notion that we can make a profit, that we care about people, and that we care about the planet, right? So if you're here this morning, you're obviously interested, this is where we have to go. And so this movement, all of us, right, have to become part of it, because at this time of further division and the debate and the swamp in Washington and all those things, imagine if we could build this movement of folks who believe that business and profits could also create change. So for me, it was a no-brainer, having worked with looking at how do we create and preserve jobs, again, housing, and then how do you create jobs, and how do you keep it all in a neighborhood. For me, B Corps are hugely important. You know, you look at their model, whether it's the fact that they're twice as likely to provide health insurance to their workers. Globally, one of the things that attracted me was that 3 times more likely to be owned by minorities and women. So of course, I was like, whoa, wait a minute. Absolutely, right? And then, you know, they're 30 times more likely to contribute and look at their model about being a real member of the community. And so when I went on this quest about becoming the B Corp capital of the world, obviously we had good organizations like the Sustainable Business Network. There was this whole Impact Philly movement that was going on. And for me, because I'm still on this journey, is how do I become the hub? How do I create a hub of like-minded people, right? So using transit-oriented development, using a planning model, using preservation of land, and now how do you bring folks in? And so we took the legislation that was in the books, having challenged the fact that net profits is huge, And we wrote, again, with the Sustainable Business Network and all the other folks, we created a Jumpstart New Sustainable Business tax for new businesses, and that's why I would come out to Rosemont in any school that wants to talk about B Corps, is because this, as millennials look about where you're going to live and where you're going, what are you going to do in the world, this is clearly the model that they should be looking at. And we now have a business tax exemption for gross and net profits for 3 years if you come in looking at becoming a B Corp. So I'm here recruiting you. Come to Philadelphia, come to the 7th Councilmatic District, and come to my York and Dolphin hub. And I've been working, and my husband has been very, he is so committed in it that we actually bought one of the buildings that we're looking to create this nucleus business hub. So he's actually working on it, because he was ahead of me on this stuff. But come to York and Dolphin, where we believe, and again, the other component of how I look at community development and transformative community development is public spaces, right? So, you know, as much as the mayor now is talking about rebuilding public spaces, one of the things we were very clear about is public spaces, the environment, green spaces are an important component to the quality of life, right, and amenities, right? So you got to create all of those things. So land utilization, planning, housing affordability, and then keeping jobs in the neighborhood, to me, are hugely important. And notwithstanding the crash of the market and everything that's happened, you know, I like to think that all these toolboxes that we're putting in place, when supported appropriately and correctly, I think will create a model for, you know, again, I'm very, very committed to diversity, right? There's a whole discussion around gentrification and people feeling displaced. And for me, it's always been about, you know, that York and Dolphin station, there's 14 languages spoken in that corridor, right? So to me, it's sort of like, how do we keep all that uniqueness? I don't want to go into a neighborhood that everybody's the same, right? It is about that diversity that becomes hugely important. And, you know, to quote Madeleine Albright, you know, in her work, and this is her quote, "In my work, I often wonder to what extent businesses can help society in its goals to alleviate poverty, preserve ecosystems, and build strong communities." And of course, she's a fan of B-Lab, which she believes is one of the ways that we go. So for Philadelphia, our challenge is, with our poverty rate, with our challenges, how do we become more intentional in our purpose, and how do we support this? And my challenge to all of you today, as you think about what kind of transformative change you want to create, and one of the things I particularly love about some of the B Corp folks that I sat with, you know, this intellectual property, you're going to be in a global market. You could be located anywhere right today and do business. But the idea that you can be wherever you want and be having global impact about what the work that you're doing is hugely important. So, you know, I want to encourage you to look at this as really a model, not only in what you're doing as your business, but also where you consume, right? So the ability of this movement to really grow, and I know as we talked about Whole Foods and others, is really about where we spend our money. And you know, millennials are into branding, and I think the B Corp certification is very, very difficult. And that's why in instituting this business tax, you know, there's a one-pager, there's an outline based on the framework that's on their website, but it is a high bar. And if you even just aspire to get there, we're going to be better off, right? Although we should all aspire for that branding of what is B Corp. You know, having that brand is one that should be important, and the bar should be high. But being able to purchase support the B corporations is even more important. And I really do believe that this movement is going to take off. And there are other ways around the connectivity that I think for public policy and government folks that we need to look at. You know, pension funds. You know, how do we encourage pension funds to build that equity and provide that equity to support this movement? So I think that B Corps are now old enough, right? There's enough data. It is now a value proposition. You either believe in it or you don't. If you believe in it, then government and other folks need to adjust ourselves to facilitate that process. And for me, the future of Philadelphia and the neighborhoods that I represent depend on it, right? It's not about these big chain corporations coming into a neighborhood. You know, every time people talk about corridor development, it's sort of like, you know, do I need a Starbucks or, you know, no, I'll take a mug shop, coffee shop. I'll take the other things, right? Coffee's better. So that's what you want to encourage, and I think that's the future of building diverse, equitable neighborhoods. And for the city of Philadelphia, I think it's the only way we survive. So, thank you. So I'll take a couple questions. We answered all your questions. Anyone looking to come to Philly?
How have you seen I guess the political landscape change in the past, you know, say 10 years or 15 years that shows that there is real credibility to what you're saying?
I think that obviously the network that's being created, the Sustainable Business Network, Impact Philly, I think we're still very young in that. I think that's where government has to make it a priority, right? We need to work with our partners on the ground. We need to create these tax incentives. We need to add the connectivity around land, right? You know, there's a B Corp in Philadelphia that does real estate. You know, how do we every single business that we're intentional about supporting, how do you put those connectivities so that it's not in isolation, right? And that's why for me, picking a geography was part of that. It's like, can I connect land, affordability, commercial, neighborhood, green space, and how do I bring that nucleus of folks? So it's very early stages of that, although, you know, a lot of the work is around government really believing it. And we've seen an uptick in the applications in the city. I don't think we advertise it as much as we should, and that's part of my challenge, right, is figuring out, again, the connectivity of all those different things. Because I don't think the movement survives by itself. It really does have to have all of those things. And that's why I say we have to consume, right? We have to say everything that we're going to do can be supported by a B Corp, right?
Thank you.
Thank you for being here today. I think when we think about changing our businesses to a B Corp or becoming more sustainable, it sometimes feels almost academic, like theory, and making those business decisions. And I'm curious about if you can share perhaps a brief story of the human effect. So someone within your district that you feel has benefited from this type of thinking in business, like on the ground.
So all the folks that I visited were, again, the certification and just thinking of the business. To me, anybody who just goes through the questionnaire is ahead of it, right? Because it's all the little things around profit, where you buy, where you locate, construction materials, right? So I have an architectural firm that is looking at, materials that we use, the kind of materials that we use. So I think the sky's the limit. It's like, how do we connect those? Like, I'm always challenged and about how do you say to folks, you can build in a sustainable way, right? We talk about Philadelphia's in year 9, we're in year 6 of a 25 infrastructure, water department kind of infrastructure piece, right? So people talk about green roofs are cute, right? But it has to be more than that, right? It has to be more than cute. There's a financial viability around managing water. There's the added amenities that can come with all of that. So one of the things that, for instance, when I was pushing the water department to tie into our Department of Rec of my green space stuff. It was sort of, in government, it was just sort of hard to get these two departments with opposing missions, or not opposing missions, with their own independent goals. It's like, how is it one and the same, right? Is the water department going to create a new infrastructure, green structure in an empty lot, but I have a ballpark across the street? The connectivity of that, right? In government, we're just not trained that way, right? And so now we finally have the water department working with the Department of Rec. You know, to me, the next stage of this is, you know, we can't preach what we don't practice. So we have not energy efficient buildings. We don't build efficiently. We don't have green roofs in our own public facilities. And so you got to change that thinking of we need to do this, because we can't preach it if we don't practice it. So we're struggling with that internally. We have these capital discussions, and they always say it's a cost issue, right? And it's a cost issue because we're dealing with folks who don't share that same value, right? We're paying for a premium of construction right now in the city of Philadelphia. And it's like, why aren't we putting green roofs in every firehouse and police district? And every time I hear, well, you know, if you disturb 15,000 square feet of land, then regulations kick in. I'm like, the ones you wrote? It's like, come on. And I don't say it as nicely, by the way, because it's just a frustrating notion that we're not doing that. So it's going to be hard to get people to buy in if we're not part of that. If we don't look at it as again, government, particularly in infrastructure, right? When you talk about green space and amenities in neighborhoods, when you talk about public transportation, when you talk about bike lanes and all this other, I mean, it's just there. So, you know, we have a $10 billion capital budget, and I'd like to be able to say to you as a public elected official that we're doing the right infrastructure investments, and I don't think we are. I mean, I think we're getting better, but we have a lot more work to do.
I'm a resident of Center City, and also my son attends a Philadelphia school district school. So when you talk about business building, community, and green spaces, I'd like to know what your thoughts are about businesses' responsibility to help our public schools. They're woefully underfunded.
So that's where tax policy becomes huge, right? So we have this robust tax abatement program. Even as we discuss public education today and local leadership around public education, but the entire funding mechanism for what we're looking at relies mostly on residential folks paying for public education. And I think the Chamber of Commerce has done some things around it, but they're getting, and we are having this discussion, it's the middle of budget season, so I'll say it now, you know, we have millions and millions of dollars in tax breaks that are going to be coming in the Trump era, right? But we're not looking to the business community to bear some of the stability funding that we need in the schools right now, right? Everything is on the residential piece of it. And so I think we could be more intentional about what we ask the business community to do. The fact that we still have loopholes in what they pay. When you look, you know, part of when I was doing the business tax analysis, and I worked with eConsult and other folks, and I can't say I had to sign a confidentiality agreement, but it is safe to say that all of the big corporations in the city of Philadelphia claim they make no profit in the city of Philadelphia, and they get away with it. A third of our properties are listed under nonprofit corporations, so we $10 billion endowment. It's hard to have those conversations. I mean, again, when I was working on this small component, again, I was thinking about how do I support small businesses and compromising at $100,000. We have bad tax policy. I'm looking at mixed income housing right now, right? Because we're becoming a very segregated downtown. And asking developers to provide affordability downtown so that we don't become not only a very wealthy downtown, but only a white downtown, right? Folks, this is not doable. This is not doable, and because folks are greedy. We're in a capitalist society. People are greedy. And the fact that they think people can work for the city of Philadelphia, but as a city worker, I can't afford to live downtown, is this notion. So all of that to say that the business community can do more. And what I've seen, what works in capitalist society is people will conform to the new pieces, right? This notion that a development project won't work if we eliminate or roll back abatements, that we have an affordability component is not true, and that we properly fund our schools, right? When, as successful as Penn Alexander in West Philadelphia, where University of Penn gives there, that's a perfect example of the kind of further segregation that we create if we don't have a student-weighted formula where we invest in what the child needs, you know. But I think in the city of Philadelphia, because the portfolio has changed, and I'm a founder of a charter school, because the public education portfolio has changed, we've not articulated what every neighborhood should have. I believe every neighborhood should have a good K-8 school, right? Kids for high school make choices, whether it's a CTE school, whether it's high academic. We've not done that. So we have these constant conversations where we pit groups of folks against each other as opposed to saying, the value is this, and what is the value proposition investment that we need to get there? And we don't do it. You know, right now, as we talk about local control, I asked the administration, are we going to insist that the new school district board create a student-weighted formula of funding education, right? And they said no. So we have to challenge ourselves, you know, performance-based budgeting, all the things, so we can show people value and efficiency, effectiveness, savings, and reinvestment based on our values. We're not there yet. It's very hard for governments to do that, I get it, right? But I think, and that's what I like about this particular movement is that value is built in, right? Getting government to become B Corp minded of how do you manage people's money in an efficient way. I don't think we look at that. How do you add efficiency for program effectiveness? You know, we want kids to go to a school that's safe. Right now, the whole discussion around schools is buildings, right? And I want kids to go into a good building, but I just need the building to be clean. I don't need the school district to take a $2 billion loan so that we give more work to the construction industry and the programming doesn't work. So yeah, so the value proposition about those goals is hugely important and missing. And big business will not ever do the right thing. We have to force them. And we need leadership at the political level to just do it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilwoman Quinones-Sanchez. And thank you also, Bart Houlihan. Both of you have set the stage for this event with some very thought-provoking material and information. I hope our business students will think carefully about this, because this very much is the wave of the future, if you will. Our breakout sessions will begin shortly at 10:10. Sessions will take place in rooms 212, 315, and here in the theater, and you can consult your program for the titles and abstracts of those sessions. And again, just as a quick reminder, as you head to your session, please take note of the student posters in the lobby that reflect the work that our students are doing. Again, thank you, and we'll see you at 11 o'clock to be convened for the culminating panel session. Thank you.
Do you have a card? One of these, do you have a card? So, right at the
Everybody is getting
highly educated, you might have 5 apprentices, right? So it doesn't matter your opinion.
What are we hashtagging today? What are we hashtagging?
His name's like well, I was kind of like oh, you participate in the shake? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. When you said that, we're the
Oh, one for John.
In fact, I just had my assistant email me. Video, 3-minute video. The interesting thing about what you did is we had I was in your house for the we were
Right.
We're going to show these guys.
So well. I got you.
No, it's very good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, we do student project course consultation. So we can have companies in your neighborhood who are interested in applying to do consultation. So that's another thing. For example, well, I've been talking to, we haven't quite been able to get this yeah, who's a grad. I had a conversation with John is related to Brad. No. John is a venture capitalist. He and I just put together because there's another conference started in the city. And he is one of the leading forces with them. Well, that's
yeah, so it is great.
oh, of course, yeah. So the idea that
Actually, you know what?
Yeah.
Jay, I'm
Alright, well, I'll let you get the fans here. And then I'm talking to Andrew, we're getting up to date on the SDG, we'll find oh, perfect. Thank you. Of course, yes, you did.
Yes. Yes, it was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you. Yeah,
Going out for 40 years, 50 years.
sit through, but that's what it means. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're in the Fishtown side or what? Or Square side? Okay, so you're going up to Howard Gate then? Yeah. Okay, awesome. Look at the Carter and its positions right off the cousins and its ideas. That's actually one of the ones we're looking to create a transportation. To allow for density. That's one of the ones. We're working with the neighborhood around that. Because everybody associates for development with like outsiders moving in, so it's like how do you balance out? It's on the
somewhere along the way, society. I'm with the founder. I will let you know. I can tell you this afternoon. I'll take a look. Perfect. Brian, what's the list?
Oh, nice. PWTC radio. Yeah, Ernie Jones. Yeah. So hard. Oh yeah. So you're students?
Folks, if you're here for the next session on the common good, I'd invite you all to come down.
Move down here. Just like class. Can't sit back.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. I grew up in Honey Park. All Honey Park? Yes.
Community college.
Obviously very biased. Thank you again, Doctor. All right.
It worked. So you have authority? We'll get started here. You had dynamic, passionate people. You know, you had an ethics entrepreneur and a progressive politician.
Now you get more academic philosophy. I'm sorry. I'm not going to give case studies. I'm not going to give some kind of inspirational examples. I'm going to do what people in philosophy do, and that's to talk about frameworks to understand things. So Barbour had said at one point in his address that he thought the B-Lab movement and the social responsibility movement was a moral imperative. And I agree, but I also think that a lot of times the more progressives think that because something is good, it is therefore something that you ought to do. And I don't think that that can stand just as it is. I think you need some kind of better account for why something is an obligation. So that's what I want to talk about. I typically don't use PowerPoint, but there's some concepts here that I just want to have us keep track of. So here's the question I want us to talk about. Do corporations have a responsibility to promote the common good? And I'm going to give you some framework, and then from that framework we can just have a conversation in the time that's remaining. Alan's suggesting that we're going to end at around 10 of so that we have time for the plenary panel. So here's the question. But to answer that question requires that you answer two other questions. It requires that you have some understanding of what the common good is. Because if you say business has an obligation to promote the common good, you've got to know what that common good is. And then when you talk about the common good, you're talking about actions that benefit others. And here's a question, that our approach to business historically, at least over the last 50 years, is really not taken seriously. Why should business have a responsibility to be its greatest speed? So I want to talk about the notion of common good, try to get an idea about that, and then I'm going to talk about some ideas about responsibility. And the end product is supposed to be a conclusion that says, yes, business does have a responsibility for the welfare of others, but I want to try to explain why that's the case. So, common good. It's a phrase that's used a lot, but it's a phrase that's ambiguous. There are lots of different ways in which this is understood. The two of the dominant ways are a utilitarian perspective, which basically says that our obligations are to maximize the aggregate welfare. This is a kind of mathematical understanding of ethics, where you add up all the benefits and costs of a particular action or policy, and you compare that action or policy to alternatives, and you pick the one that has the best bottom line in terms of happiness or aggregate welfare. It's an aggregate. It's sum. It's net in its understanding of common good. There's a different approach, though, that comes out of Catholic social thought, and this approach says that common good is achieved when the basic good of each and all is promoted, is achieved. This is a non-aggregative approach. This is not adding, subtracting, and summing and getting a net. This is saying that we achieve the common good when everyone, distributedly, every single individual, has the opportunity to live a flourishing existence. So this is a different approach to the common good than the utilitarian, which is cost, benefit, net. This is saying everyone, individually, should have an opportunity to live a flourishing life. There's some problems with the, I'd say, probably dominant understanding of the common good, the utilitarian one. One is that it's excessively demanding, and the other is that it doesn't really have room for recognizing human rights. So let's talk about the excessively demanding. If you believe the common good is to be understood in terms of maximizing net aggregate welfare, every time you have to make a decision, you have to ask, if I do this, am I achieving greater good than if I did that? I like Guinness. So I would have to, every single time I'm about to buy a pint of Guinness, I'd have to ask, could I spend this, whatever it is, $5, $6, $7, in a different way that would have a greater net impact on the happiness or welfare of people? And the answer is always going to be yes. Right? I like it a lot, but I don't like it that much. Right? So utilitarianism is basically going to demand of you an unreasonable expectation that you never think about your own satisfaction, your own welfare, because you always have to think, is there some way I can do this that would benefit more people, aggregately, net? So that's the first problem. The second problem is that an aggregate or net understanding of the common good, where you just balance costs and benefits of alternatives, allows you to trade off the interests of one person in order to achieve a better bottom line for the group. So you could argue, under utilitarianism, at least in theory, slavery would be okay. If the small population that was enslaved, you know, they suffer, but they work in a way that benefits a larger group, and you add up all that, you come out ahead. So there's the possibility, at least under the aggregate approach to common good, that you don't allow for rights. So I think a better approach is the idea that you should understand the common good as achieved when every single person has really the opportunity to live a flourishing life and have basic goods. Now let's talk about the second part, responsibility. When we talk about responsibility, talking about duties, what are people obliged to do? What is their duty? One way to cut up duties is to talk about the distinction between negative and positive duties. And another way to cut up duties is to talk about the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties. So these are two classic philosophical distinctions about duties or responsibility. And I want to talk about these, and we'll see how this, together with the idea that the common good means pursuing a social environment where each and every person has the opportunity to live a flourishing life, pairing that idea of the common good with these ideas of responsibility, give us a credible way to argue that business has a hard obligation to promote the common good. So let's talk about this first pair, negative, positive duty. Okay. How many of you students have seen these concepts in your class? Okay, a handful. This is a standard distinction in ethics. A negative duty is the duty not to directly harm someone's basic interests. So an example of a negative duty would be, don't murder. That's telling you that you can't take an act that directly interferes and harms someone's basic interests. Positive duty, on the other hand, is a duty to assist others when they are in dire need. And the standard example here is if you come across a child who's fallen into a pool, a shallow pool, but is drowning, and there's nobody around, you have an obligation to assist. You have to do something. It's not just, I didn't push the kid into the pool, right? It's, you have to actually go and save the kid. So a positive duty is a duty to provide assistance when someone is in serious need. In our culture, unfortunately, we often think only about negative duties. Duties where we are required not to harm directly some other person. We don't think enough about the duties we have to assist others who are in need. And that is, I think, a serious flaw in our sort of cultural moral conception. Positive duties exist. You have to recognize them. They exist when four conditions are satisfied. When there's a serious need that somebody else has, when you have the ability to really assist and help solve that problem, that need, when in offering the assistance, you're not placing yourself in comparable risk, and when it's not likely that help will come from any other source. So, save the drowning child example. Child in a small pool and you're walking by, obviously, you need to save that child. If someone is drowning offshore, 100 yards offshore, and caught in a strong undertow and you can't swim, that's a different story. You don't necessarily have to try to swim out and risk yourself. If you did, that would be what we call supererogatory, above and beyond the call of duties. Not something you're required to do, but something that we should say is good. So if you have the ability to assist, but you're placing yourself in comparable risk, we don't want to say you're obliged to assist. We want to say that you should be praised if you tried. But if you didn't try, we don't say we condemn you, you failed. So positive duty, a duty to assist, it applies in certain circumstances. The fact that it only applies in certain circumstances shows, I think, that just because something is good, trying to save that person 100 yards offshore, doesn't mean that you are obliged to do it. if you're placing yourself in comparable risk. So not everything that is good is therefore something you are obliged to do. Right? So we have this distinction, negative and positive duty. Not to harm, duty to assist. Duty to assist in certain conditions. Now how about this other distinction? Perfect duties and imperfect duties. Any students hear this before? This is a little more obscure, I think. Right, Ron? So a perfect duty is a duty that you have, and you have it on every occasion that the situation arises. It always requires that you discharge the duty. So the previous example, do not murder. Oh, you know, in this case I'm not going to murder. But in some other case I can? No. The duty applies universally, always, every time. That's a perfect duty. An imperfect duty is a duty that applies only on some occasions. You have some discretion about when you discharge it, when you act on the duty, but you have to do it at least some occasions. So in almost every religion, the sort of ethical frameworks of almost every religion, there is an imperfect duty of charity. If you are affluent, you have a duty at some point in time to contribute to charity. That doesn't mean you've got to contribute to every, I was going to use something I shouldn't say, every time those irritating phone calls come at dinner and they're asking you for money, you don't have an obligation to contribute every time you pick up the phone with one of those calls. But if you are affluent and you never contribute to anything, that's a failure of duty. And every single religious tradition says that. So an imperfect duty is a duty where you have some discretion about when you discharge it, but you cannot decline to discharge it ever. Right? So if you take those two pairs, negative, positive, perfect, imperfect, you get this. You get a little matrix. You can get cases where there are negative duties of a perfect sort. Do not murder, I use the example in both cases. There's not really going to be a negative duty that's imperfect. That's going to be the null set. You can't make choices about when you're going to discharge the duty not to murder. But if you have a positive duty, you can have a perfect positive duty. Every time that child, you come across a child in a shallow pool that's drowning, you have an obligation to assist. Every single time. But you can also have an imperfect positive duty where you have to contribute to charity, at least on some occasions if you are affluent. If you fail ever to contribute to charity, you have morally failed. So, how do we then argue for Barth's claim that this idea of socially responsibility of business is a moral imperative? How do we argue for the claim that business does in fact have a responsibility to be its brother's keeper? Well, we can argue that business has positive duties of both a perfect and imperfect sort. Perfect positive duty to prevent harm to others' basic goods. Think about the pharmaceutical companies. There's an argument that there is a positive, perfect duty for them to give differential pricing in indigent nations that are suffering from serious epidemics. This is a classic case where the antiretrovirals, the anti-HIV drugs, were priced so high that you couldn't get the life-saving drugs distributed in say, sub-Saharan Africa. And there's an argument, they resisted for a long time, but there's an argument to say that pharmaceutical companies have an obligation to lower their price so that those drugs are more available in those nations that are less affluent. You can also say that business has imperfect positive duties to assist in solving social problems, at least on some occasions. And of course, the instances for assistance can be chosen, but they cannot morally always be denied. And I had this slide up last night, and it was interesting to hear Councilwoman Sanchez talk in response to the question about schools. So you could argue that some businesses have a responsibility to help with the economic circumstances that we find in especially impoverished urban schools. They don't have to contribute. Not every business has to contribute every time to every school, but some businesses have a responsibility to contribute, and that contribution could be targeted to schools. So, we can argue that business has a responsibility to promote the common good, understood as the good of each and all in Catholic social tradition. And that's especially true, perhaps, in areas where there's a business competence or a dire social need. So we can identify, say, businesses that have a competence in the area of science, and maybe they would have an imperfect positive duty to help local school districts teach science to children. So what I've tried to argue is to give some kind of a philosophical background, a framework, to explain why people like Bart say this socially responsible business movement is a moral imperative. If you think about the traditions in philosophy distinguishing between negative and positive duties, perfect and imperfect duties, and if you think about the Catholic social thought understanding of the common good, you can get a good, clear, defensible reason for supporting what the activists like Bart are arguing. So I'll just leave it there and open it to questions. We've got 10 minutes, 15 minutes for questions. Issues? Anything you didn't understand or questions? Yes?
When times are good, it's easy to be charitable. Let's take the grocery business that Bart talked about with John Mackey. When you see old Whole Foods and you're overcharging people 15 to 25%, you got money to burn. He gives away 5%. Then he runs out of money because people say, God, we're being taken. And he's got to sell his business after closing stores to Amazon. How does a store, ShopRite, Giant, whomever, how do you operate a cutthroat business and operate profitably?
I think you can.
How do you contribute
Right.
to the common good when you want to keep people employed?
I think it can be done. And if we go back to the notion of what I was arguing was positive duty, right? So a positive duty to contribute to charity, it was a positive but imperfect duty. So a positive duty exists when there is need, you have the ability to assist, there's no comparable harm. So we could question whether the second and third conditions are satisfied when the business itself is under economic threat. If they don't have the ability to assist, or if they try to assist and they go out of business, no profit, no mission, they all, then we can say that in those conditions, the four conditions are not fully satisfied, and maybe there isn't a positive duty. But I wouldn't want to go I wouldn't want to go too far down that road, because almost every business is going to say, oh, we're operating on a thin margin. And almost every family is going to say, I had a student class last semester, I'm at St. Joe's, right? So I'm a faculty member at St. Joe's. And if you know about private Catholic school tuition, it's not cheap. So one of the students said, we talked about this issue of contributing to charity. Well, when I get out of here and I have a family and, I have tuitions to pay for my own children, I have a mortgage, I don't think I'm going to have any responsibility to contribute to the indigent. It's the same argument, right? But I don't believe it's true that there's no opportunity to give any contribution. Maybe the contribution has to be scaled back. But he's thinking of a very, he wants the McMansion, he wants the... So there are some opportunities for asking questions about how you're allocating your funds. So that would be the response.
Is part of the common good keeping your people employed?
Sure, right, and that's why I said that you can't necessarily argue that when the business margin is so thin that they should be contributing to external charities, even if they're aligned with business competence. But I don't want to say that that's true in all cases, and I want to start making finer distinctions about are you really going to go out of business if you don't make some small contribution, some attempt? You could even just give your employees the opportunity to volunteer, right? So the reason I'm kind of resisting is that I hear constantly from businesses and business students that if I do X, I can't be profitable. And that's an empirical question. In some cases it's true, but in other cases it's not. It's just a cover for not worrying about anything other than the bottom line.
I'm thinking the debate between John Mack and Milton Friedman, and is Dr. Cuddy here?
Yeah, well, he was a moment ago, but he's...
Okay. Who's the high-tech person who's in that debate? Works for micro, whatever. And the high-tech guy is saying, we don't contribute, we'll give people some time off, but effectively, the fact that we're in business and we're price competitive and we're in a very tough market, and my people are well paid, and let them do their own thing. They're adults, isn't that enough?
Yeah. What's their margin?
Probably higher than you guys.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking that question. It's an easy way, sort of, oh, I don't have these responsibilities because I don't have the ability to assist. It would be a big risk. That's an empirical question. You can't just take at face value an answer that says it would be too costly. You have to look at the details.
I think, when the Citizens United decision
Find money for that.
Came down, and I'm still horrified by that. However, there is a way of looking at it in the sense that if you're going to grant that kind of human characteristic to a corporation and to an organization, then you can also, then it is kind of an equal argument to say, well, then you also have the obligation and you're compelled to also contribute in different ways. So if you get kind of the benefit of doing that to move your interests forward, then you also, all of that becomes some sort of a right. And so I think this whole argument is based on the idea that organization is, I wouldn't say it's a citizen, right? But it's in some ways in the same way as an individual human being is. But it's an entity that plays a role in the larger society. That's one thing. And the other thing is, for me, it comes down to what is the core purpose of a business. And I think that it has morphed over time. I think the original reason was to create value for society, for the owner and their family, for the employees, for the consumers, for the community. And then over time, through a number of ways, it became about the entire purpose was its own survival and its own thriving through profitability. So I think all of this is predicated upon shifting that back to seeing business beyond as a purpose in addition to profit. That profit is a result that enables it to keep doing that.
I agree. I mean, I think what happened is that in the 1970s in particular, there were some influential academic pieces, articles, that ended up defining the content of business education with the message that the purpose of business is to maximize shareholder value. It's all about the bottom line. Previously, and as Alan will probably ask questions at the panel, previously I think there was a little bit more of a broader notion of purpose. I think that what I was arguing was a way of looking at ethics as a constraint on behavior, such that while certainly you can pursue profit, you cannot pursue profit by neglecting your duties. So the duties place a constraint on the pursuit of profit. I also agree with what you said, that there's another way to talk about ethics and business, and I think both, these are not incompatible, they both need to go together. The other way to talk about ethics and business is to fold the notion of ethical sensibility into the purpose of the business. And I think that that's valuable because it's a motivating mechanism within the business. But, Bart said, business as a force for good, we talk about community, employees, environment. Two different ways to think about this. You can make it as part of your purpose that you are supporting your employees. But I think it's also the case that there is an ethical obligation to treat your employees in particular ways. So, if you go back to Catholic social thought, I think there's an ethical obligation in terms of how and when you institute a layoff for employees. Even if it's not part of your purpose, I think there's an ethical obligation there that you don't, call them into your office and march them back to their desk so they clean out their desk and they leave. They're human beings. They have to be treated with respect and dignity. So I think there's an ethical obligation. But you can also make it part of your DNA and part of your purpose. The idea of a business as a person, though, which was the first part of your question, Ron Dusky and I were just talking about that earlier. We're not fans of that. So the Citizens United is based upon that idea. But it does make sense to think about organizations having rights.
And responsibility.
And responsibility. So my emphasis is on the responsibility, right.
Everybody
Correct.
wants rights.
Yeah.
They don't want to take
Yeah.
responsibility. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No. Well, that's true of individuals, but it's also true of organizations, right?
Yes.
Correct. I don't use the word right. All of them mean it today. There's a question way in the back, and I think this will be the last question, Alan.
I think you might have time for
Okay.
one after that. Yeah.
Speak up loudly.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So when you discuss like positive duty, is it a business positive duty to not employ the only people that are connected into their interconnected system, like their friends or their family, when there are people who like travel? Like I worked with the Red Cross for a amount of time, and there was someone who traveled from Texas all the way over here to get a job at a high business corporation, and the businessman ended up hiring his son, and he was left without a job and he was impoverished, and he had no home.
So every one of these items where we're going to ascribe a duty, whether it's a positive or a negative duty, every one of these items is something that we would need to look case by case and debate about. But I can even see someone arguing that not only not a positive duty, but a negative duty, a duty not to discriminate. So if you have an organization that is just old boys network and has not ever hired, and maybe not conscious intentional discrimination, but de facto discrimination, there's an issue about treating people with dignity that says that we should not discriminate between people on the basis of features over which they have no control, and that would include gender, race, disability, right? So I think you could even go back to the notion of a negative duty, not to discriminate. It's hard when it's a small business. If the owner knows family business, I could see the possibility that you could argue that it is within moral limits to hire your son. But again, we have to talk about the case and look at the details.
Even if the son doesn't have as much qualifications as a person who's not related to
Yeah, well then you have another issue, because now you have the rights of the clients or customers of the business who may actually be damaged by an incompetent performance of the job. So when we talk about ethical questions, there are lots of different things that we would have to disentangle, but clearly if the person is not competent, that's another issue. You could argue that it's a question of fairness in the selection process. You could also argue that it's a question of fairness to the customers or the clients of the organization and make sure that they get real service.
I think one more last question.
I'm going to take a student. Okay, sorry, David.
Hi. I was thinking a lot about Councilwoman Sanchez and how she's talking about businesses entering Philadelphia at that intersection that has been affected negatively by gentrification. And so I was wondering, looking at your little chart about positive, negative duties, imperfect duties, how can organizations entering Philadelphia and wanting to serve these communities can do so in the most ethical way, providing their services, but also not negatively impacting these communities that are disrupted by gentrification.
Well, one way, and she spoke to this, not to structure your business so that you pay nothing to the community. that you have a responsibility to the community in which you operate. You could call it a positive imperfect duty or positive duty of a perfect sort. You might then start thinking about an obligation to not only provide service to the community, but to provide employment to the community. And if you provide employment, that might counteract some of the gentrification effect because there'd be income, but I don't know, I'm not sure what I would say, but clearly I think there are reasons for arguing that the business has a positive duty to assist the local community. And there's a serious societal need. They're part of the community, so they have an obligation to assist, I would say. And, you know, we might argue that it's like saving the drowning child in a small pool.
I think the best bet would be to contact your local representatives and ask them what they need. I mean, they're the ones who are working on the grounds and talking to people who are struggling. If you really want to know what that community needs and bring to them, you have to ask.
The business should ask.
The business should ask. Is there one street that's better than another street? Is there a way that we can help contribute that is really needed in one way better than another way?
Without forcing out current residents, without pricing them out.
Or this is what our plan is, here's our mission. Tell us how we can do our mission while helping with the same.
And I think you can find case studies in Francisville of both sides, of businesses that have been seen as not helpful to the community, but also businesses that have been seen as helpful. So Francisville is on the other side of Broad Street from Councilman Sanchez's district, but it is also going through gentrification. You know, same thing along the river ward going up to Delaware, going up from Benjamin Franklin Parkway, the same thing is happening. So it happened in Fairmount, and it's creeping up, so now it's happening in Francisville. And there are some businesses there that appear to be good community citizens, and there appear to be some businesses there that are not. And so you can get, I think, a good case study of looking at how businesses have operated in the community to see what their effects have been. Okay.
We have one final question.
One final question.
I guess it's just that I think for a lot of people that are here, making the case, like, should corporations be social minded? It is. Like,
Preaching to the choir.
I agree. Yeah. It's more or less, to me, the question is like, well, how to get those corporations and how to get people to believe that that's what they should do. Like, you can't just say this is what you should do. It's some people just aren't going to do it.
Right. That's why I think, believe it or not, I think that there is a practical role for theoretical work and philosophy. In that, if you just tell them this is your responsibility, what? You've got to have a credible, convincing answer as to why it's your responsibility. And what I'm trying to do is to give a set of conceptual tools that allow us to say, well, if you don't think it's your responsibility, well, how do you answer these? Now, that's all at the conceptual, cognitive level, and we also have to work on the gut level to convince them. But my experience has been that if you don't have the cognitive defense, and you only have the gut level, you've got people who've got the gut, yes, it is your responsibility, no, it's not your responsibility, and then you're at an impasse. So I think it's a necessary but not sufficient element of trying to generate a framework that gets people to come along.
Open that conversation.
Exactly.
Thanks very much.
It's a largely finance part of the world, and I'm involved with education. So Pride is Pride is the association of individuals who are responsible for management. So St. Joseph's
all my cousins go
so out of all the stories, Franny Karen part of the wheel.
Mother, Mary All, sister from she's across the street from you guys.
I went to one of the workshops and they take me so we actually do that.
Okay, so I heard he said it really is it's not the organization to have no, anyway, that's my kind of I've been way too well, you know, because I'm running it part of the mission that it is
Is there a academic we have a program where we actually train students to do this.
No, I haven't watched. I'm fine. The timer would have thrown me off.
And you have a good care.
What are you thinking of doing at 11:50? Where would you like me to be in terms of speaking? Right.
We can try
Right. And now, if it's 10 up and I'm still on the panel question, am I nixing the idea? Okay, because people need to go long days.
Yeah, we should keep them at 11:50.
Okay, so I'm not, if it's 11:50, I'm not going to ask any questions after.
That's
Got
good.
it.
Even if you've gotten the last questions to this
Right.
We don't want to think
Perfect. I'm ready to go. I'm going to put my bag and my coat here. Let me get my coat. Let me get right back down here. Good.
They're invited to
well, part of that, I think, is what I've learned from having now
I don't know.
That's exactly what we're doing is relocated, who you guys can hire, or maybe even have as an intern, because these kids rock, and they will only do this kind of work. They won't go for a normal high-paying job. They're like our SWAT.
The councilwoman said something like this, someone just asked, how do you get the boards to do this? There's the councilwoman or the board, the regular council. That's not going to work. If that's the only reason. You've got to have formation of character. You look at the other others. This is well, this is great.
I love this.
Yes.
How are you? Yeah, Devin, yes, my So how's the program I'm so theoretical. I know, that's what I'm saying. Let's learn it.
Yes, I got this. It's a good
I was there for well, we anticipated 4-hour
yes.
Terrible. Great. Good to see you. Yes. Good to see you.
Well, no, the follow-up question is from Johnson is like, well, if your reason morally justified because of some metric and standard of impact, there's no metric and standard of impact that would say, well, you should not do it. I think you can't answer that. It's so nice to know. Yeah, well, I really think that our students some kind of change. I think actually one generation of kids change up sort of defense. Oh, you went, yeah. Okay. So Rod is I know we try
Well, good morning again and welcome back to our culminating panel session I hope that you found the breakout sessions informative and valuable. And we thought it would be a good idea, because none of us can be in 3 places at the same time, to invite our breakout session speakers and have them participate as a panel. So the panel will be moderated by Professor Christine Hagedorn, who's an instructor in the business program here at Rosemont. Professor Hagedorn will pose a series of questions to our panelists before opening the discussion to audience participation. Thank you.
Welcome to our final portion of our program this afternoon, the panel discussion portion. And allow me to introduce 3 experts who we thank so much for joining us for this very important discussion. To the far right, we have John Connolly Jr. John Connolly Jr. is founder, president, and CEO of Inspiritech, an inspired social entrepreneurship that adds value to the lives of disabled and disadvantaged persons throughout assistive technology and other services. He has led the development of high-profile systems for firms like AT&T, the National Disease Research Interchange, and University of Pennsylvania, United Engineers, and ActionAIDs. John has particular expertise in the development of case management systems for social services, healthcare, and managed care industries. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa and summa cum laude from Lehigh University with 3 majors: sociology, religion studies, and urban studies. He received his Master of Social Work degree from University of Pennsylvania and an MBA in Finance from Temple. Our next, seated in the middle, Ann Sudduth. As co-founder and principal of Boyer Sudduth Environmental Consultants, Ann draws on her background in the nonprofit and corporate sectors to develop and implement sustainability initiatives for K-12 schools in Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Massachusetts. Ann was previously National Director of Community Involvement at Deloitte, the global accounting and consulting firm, where she developed the U.S. firm's award-winning Community Involvement Program. Prior to joining Deloitte, Ann was Senior VP, Vice President, for Education and Workforce Development at the Partnership for New York City, the city's leading business and civic organization. Ann received the New Hampshire 40 Under 40 Award, recognizing the state's emerging young leaders in 2010, after she founded the Seacoast Women's Giving Circle, a philanthropic and civic leadership organization. Ann is LEED Green Associate Certified and Certified Zero Waste Associate through the USGBC. She holds a certificate in nonprofit management from LaSalle University's School of Business. And our third esteemed expert panelist, John McCall, seated right here. Dr. McCall is director of the Pedro Arrupe Center for Business Ethics at St. Joseph's University and affiliated faculty in the Legal Studies Department at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. A founder of the Society of Business Ethics, Dr. McCall focuses on mentoring Hobbs School of Business faculty in the Center's Fellows Program. The reason for this is so that students are assured of substantive and repeated exposure to questions of ethics in their classrooms. He has taught business ethics at the undergraduate, MBA, and executive levels, and Dr. McCall is the author of numerous journal articles, having published on issues ranging from just cause versus employment at will, free speech in the workplace, products liability, deceptive advertising, employee rights, Catholic social thought, and management theory. He is also co-author of Contemporary Issues in Business Ethics, published by Wadsworth in 2004. Please join me in thanking these experts for being willing to be here with us today and have this discussion on this very important topic. And we have prepared some questions that we would like to pose. And we'd like to frame it very informally. We'll pose the questions, and if you have a response, please don't feel obligated that every panelist must respond to each question, but if you have something you'd like to weigh in on, in no particular order, we'll start with our first question, which is really dealing with this idea. We hear about corporate social responsibility, and we've been hearing many speakers today talk about how it's been, they've been working on it for the past decade. And we hear a bit as if it's somewhat of a new trend or recent phenomenon, and yet corporate social responsibility is a concept with quite some history. For example, in 1951, the board chairman of Standard Oil, Frank Abrams, wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review, and he talked about, I'll read what he talked about, managers have a duty to conduct the affairs of the enterprise to maintain an equitable and harmonious balance among stockholders, employees, customers, and the public. And today, we hear similar dialogue, discussion from other business leaders who have that same stature that Abrams had when he was board chairman at Standard Oil. People like John McKay of Whole Foods or Howard Schultz of Starbucks, saying very similar things, like McKay saying, the world, from John McKay, the world urgently needs a richer, more holistic, and more humanistic philosophy about business than the one that we have been encountering from our economics textbooks and business schools. So here we have, 67 years ago, Abrams saying, calling for a more harmonious balance among interest groups as we conduct the affairs of the enterprise. And today, very contemporary business leaders saying a more holistic and humanistic philosophy about business. These sound similar, and I'd like to ask our panelists, in your view, is there anything different about today's voices on this issue than the voices of, say, 60-something years ago?
I think, is it on? Can you hear me? Thank you for the question. I think this is a great question, how so much changes and so much stays the same. When I was in New York City, I had the pleasure of working for an organization that was started by David Rockefeller, and he was very much still a part of the organization. And it was a group of 200 CEOs who were heads of the major corporations and major employers in the city of New York. And he would regularly sit down with this esteemed group, and he was focused on quality of life issues, right? That major employers should be thinking about quality of education, should be thinking about transportation, should be thinking about housing. But the drumbeat that he would bring up each time, this is in the 90s, that we met, was the drive for quarterly earnings versus the long-term outlook. And I thought it was interesting this morning in the talks that there were several times that were mentioned that when you look at the long term, and I think that, so I would say that there's one overlay there, which is that, the more we shift to thinking long-term impact, long-term value, the more likely we are to consider the whole of societal impact, environmental impact, people impact, as well as profit. So whenever you hear about, the quarterly earnings drive, I think that's, an alarm should go off in your mind. I think that there's been a big change, two things that I've seen. One is that because businesses are no longer, many businesses are no longer required to be place-based. You can work from anywhere. That, outside of utilities that are required to be place-based, there is no longer a sense of kind of headquarters mentality, meaning that you are, wherever your company is based, that you must be investing in that community. And so now, if you can't be anywhere, there's more of a choice basis around thinking about what your responsibility is to society more generally. And so then I think you're having to take active steps versus having that smaller orbit of being based in one place where all your employees were working there, all your employees lived there, and if you were negatively impacting the environment of your location, then you were going to hear about it because it was in everyone's backyard, right? But now it could be far away and you might never hear about it. The other thing is that I feel like, I don't know if folks saw this in the New York Times, but Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock, sent out a letter. They are the largest investor in the world. They have $6 trillion that they manage. So if you think about that in the global economy, that's an economy that is only smaller than China and the United States. So this CEO sent out a letter to all of their invested companies saying, we believe that you need to serve a social purpose in addition to a business or profit purpose, and we're going to be inquiring what you're doing to achieve that social purpose. And we're going to look at the data on your company to drive our response. So they are looking at, kilowatt hours of water usage and your diversity of your employees. And Larry Fink's team has spent years collecting and crunching data on this. And so what they've ended up saying is, when you invest for a 20 to 30-year horizon, the companies that are investing in People, Planet, Profits do better. And so we're actually investors. We're out to make money, but the companies that are doing good in the world are doing better. And so therefore, we want to invest in those companies, and we're putting everyone else on notice. So that's a difference, because they're putting money towards the companies that are doing, social good thinking. So I'll leave it at that. But I think data and not being place-based, both of those two things are different than even the 90s, and certainly the different than the 50s.
Thank you.
I have a couple thoughts about whether there's been a change from the 50s to now. And one of the, we got the questions in advance. So we don't do that with students for exams, but, well, maybe it's but it started by referencing Standard Oil's chairman who argued that managers had a duty to conduct the affairs of the enterprise to maintain an equitable and harmonious balance among various constituents. And there are two things about that that I think may be a little different than what we hear today. The first thing is that I have strong suspicion that the reason that managers had that duty in his mind was that in the long run it's going to be more profitable. There's a model of business ethics today that's been around since the 80s, but it's becoming, I think, a little bit more influential, and it's the stakeholder model. And in academic discussions of this stakeholder model, where managers' duty is to take care of all the stakeholders, there are two different ways to look at where that duty comes from. One is an instrumental approach, and the other is an intrinsic approach. So why should managers be worried about the environment, the employees? Well, because if they do, they'll make more money. So the real fundamental concern is still ultimately profit. I don't want to say anything, I teach in a business school, so I don't want to say anything bad about profit, but I do want to point out that that is an instrumental argument. You treat people well because it's beneficial for you. There's a different picture, though, and I think this is the difference today. There's an increasing emphasis, I think, in a lot of the rhetoric on a concern about the interests of these constituencies, like employees or the environment or the customers, which is intrinsic, which says that these are, in and of themselves, important, not merely as instruments for producing profit, but these are things that we need to pay attention to. So I think that's a difference. I think there's been a slight shift in what the rhetoric is intending to say. So that's the first point. The second point is maybe not as significant today as I would like to see it, but I think there is a kind of underground trend in this regard. Abrams said, it is the manager's duty. And I think a lot of the movement in business ethics and social responsibility is suggesting that authority ought to be shared within the firm. And it's not simply top-down authoritarian. So Bart was here in the morning and he was talking about
what you're going to have to do in your organizations in order to attract new talent. What are these millennials thinking about? And we're passing the millennials at this point. They want a sense of purpose, but I think they also want to have some ability to exercise influence in the corporation so that it's not simply a military model of top-down authority. So those, I think, are two differences in the rhetoric today, even though it may sound the same, compared to the rhetoric from the 50s.
Thank you so much. As we can see, this is a real delight to have such a variety of perspectives from our panelists who have a diverse set of experiences that they bring to this conversation. So thank you so much. I'll start with the next question, and it's on the notion of the common good. The common good has a long history in Western thought, beginning with the ancient Greeks. And there are a number of interpretations of this concept, although at the heart of it is that everyone has an obligation to contribute to conditions that will serve to improve the lives of all, if you will. And for example, Catholic social teaching defines the common good as, read it, the sum total of conditions which allow people, either as groups or individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and easily. Can you tell us how you understand the common good and the role of business in contributing to its development?
All right. This is really what I talk about in the breakout. So the common good, again, looking at the cheat sheet here, improve the lives of all. The logician would focus on that word all and say, how do we interpret that? One way to interpret it is in an aggregate sense. You improve the lives of all. You may actually harm the lives of some, but if you come out with a net overall improvement, you could say you're improving the lives of all in the collective or aggregate sense. The Catholic social thought view is a completely different view. It says that if you're improving the lives of all, you're improving the lives of all, where all is in the distributive sense. Each and every person deserves your attention, and our actions and policies ought to move in the direction of assuring that each and every person has those conditions necessary for leading a fulfilling, flourishing life. So if I had to pick between those two different understandings of common good, I would pick the second, because that's the one that's most compatible with, say, the tradition here, but also most compatible with recognizing that persons have rights that need to be respected.
I didn't do my homework, by the way. I've done enough homework in my life. Be that as it may, I totally agree with John, and I'm a practitioner. I'm a measly practitioner. I'm not an academic, and so therefore my life boils down to actually what happens on a day-to-day basis. And at Inspiritech, as you may have read, we call ourselves an inspired social entrepreneurship. And inspired means something, and it's derived from the word spirit, and it really means the breath of God. And there's no getting around that. We do what we do in order to meet financial performance measures, but also non-financial performance measures. And non-financial performance measures are those which seek the common good. And I think one of the challenges of this whole discussion is how does one balance non-financial performance measures and financial performance measures? And that challenge is not unique to just businesses. And because, as Ann said earlier, often the time threshold is one which is important, because folks are thinking, all right, we have to maximize return on shareholder equity, and I want to see quarterly earnings. And so folks' mindset with respect to achieving the common good, or even any good, is too often focused on the short term. And it's not just in business either. The Phillies returned home for their homestand yesterday, and the first thing, we're 3 games into the season and they're booing the manager. So how one does in the short term is all ingrained in our psyche. And I think that to some extent we have to figure out, and I think Bart is onto something, is how do we shine the light on leaders who are actually exemplifying achievement of common good and taking the long-term view. I think that's actually where you get the balance. If you can see that over the long term, the balance of common good and financial gain can be actually balanced out. Unfortunately, B Corps didn't exist in 2000 when I founded Inspiritech, so we just solved that problem by becoming a nonprofit, not having to worry about maximizing return on shareholder equity. Everything is mission-driven, and we still make a surplus because nonprofits don't make profits. We just make surplus. If you think the Wharton School is a nonprofit, they do well as well.
Thank you so much. It seems that it's taken together the comments that what we heard this morning and in the breakout sessions and just your comments thus far. The theme emerging is this idea of beware of the short-term profit making and in favor of the long-term sustainability for profit making and doing good. And with that, I'd like to pose a question that has to do with something that economist Michael Porter talks about. We know him as the father of competitive advantage, and he's built his legacy lecturing on how businesses can maximize return on investment and make the ultimate most profits through the theory of competitive advantage. And he himself jokes that for about the past 10 years, he finds himself doing more and more lecturing and writing on what he calls a higher kind of capitalism. And he says, I might be the least likely person that you'd expect to start talking about the fact that, we need to look beyond profit making. But he does talk about this idea of long-term sustainability. If firms, big business, engages in something that he calls shared value creation. And when he's talking and writing, Michael Porter likes to give examples, and I like this one example that he often cites for what we mean by what he means by shared value creation, and it's of Nestle Corporation, when they needed a steady supply of coffee beans and found in another region of the world there was a farming community. This is very similar to what Anne said about the corporation may be in Switzerland and the farming community is halfway across the globe, and yet this story will illustrate how they were able to make a difference to societal challenges halfway around the globe. So Nestle needed this supply and found a farming community that was experiencing low productivity and environmental degradation to the farming areas, and Nestle went in and provided fertilizers and farming techniques, and over a period of a couple of years, now that farming community is thriving, high productivity, high quality coffee beans where they had been low quality product. And the environmental degradation was shrinking. And so this is a really good example of how now Nestle has a steady stream of high quality coffee beans and has greatly helped an area that was struggling in their farming capacity. The example of shared value is one that Michael Porter likes to use. I wonder if any of you have an example of something similar that you like to use when you're out talking about this important topic.
So, most of my time is spent thinking about environmental sustainability, but I'm going to shift and put a different hat on. I used to work for Deloitte, which is regularly named one of the best companies to work for in the country. And years and years ago, say 20 plus years ago, the then CEO noticed that the company was bringing in 50% of its new hires in the early, right out of college were women. But then when you got to a more senior rank in the company, where were the women? They were no longer there. They were literally no longer at the firm. And everyone assumed, well, they're probably off, raising children. He said, well, where are they literally? Where are they? We want them back. We need them. We had more work they could do than they could do. And they hired a firm to do a study, and they found out, lo and behold, the women were actually at other firms. They were not at Deloitte. And so they, inquired, why not stay? What is it we're doing? And that thus began this decades-long women's initiative. And here at 2018, Deloitte's CEO is a woman. And the chair, when I was there, was a woman, and they are first in many categories like that. But I think what's interesting is that, again, back to data, what happened was as Deloitte sort of peeled the onion on their assumptions and their kind of implicit bias around this, they also asked their clients about, issues around diversity and women's representation, and they did crunch numbers, and they saw in their own consulting that their clients were receiving better service when they were providing a diverse team. And so there was this business driver that they hadn't recognized internally, which was, if we field a diverse team that has representation from all around the world, that has women, that has men, that has all different perspectives and experience, then it's going, it goes down to undergrads who have an accounting background and also undergrads that are literature majors, people who are whose training is different. And so I think it's interesting because it goes back to that idea of, how do you examine your existing practices and say, where is their value to the community more broadly? And I would say, in Deloitte's case, they have sort of taken on this mantle of being a standard bearer, of being a place that is a good place to work, not just for women, but for everyone. The new female CEO just announced that she's giving 16, the whole company is now providing 16 weeks of paid leave. And it's not parental leave, it is leave. So it means if there's anyone who needs you, whether it's your partner or an adult, a senior family member, or there's some sort of other crisis, you have 16 weeks of leave. You determine whether the leave is something you need to take, and that is honoring their employees' diversity and diversity of needs in a way that I think would not have happened had this 20 plus years ago, this initiative not examined the expectations and the implicit biases that were embedded in the institution. So it's a little bit off of your thing, but I think it's important to demonstrate linkages between other issues of inclusion and sustainability and thinking about people and profits.
I guess from my point of view, I think that businesses and really any organization that conducts enterprise, be it commercial, government, or nonprofit, could actually learn a lot from religious institutions and orders with respect to where values come from. Our dear friends over at St. Joe's, they have Magis, which as you see around and about. Ignatius Loyola for the greater glory of God. And Men and Women for Others. I seem to be pretty good at this. As I tell people, I was almost a Jesuit, 6 days removed, and then I put it off for a year. I'll tell the story pretty quickly. It gets me into trouble. At our anniversary this year, I told my wife, I said, gee, we've been married for 33 years. I've spent my whole life working in a nonprofit profession, and I raised 4 boys. I basically realized I gave up a life of poverty, celibacy, and obedience. Poverty, celibacy, and I only say that when she's not. Anyway, I digress. Those are values and virtues I think is very important. And also, in bringing home here to Rosemont, just some values and virtues that are right within the SHCJ community. These are words from Cornelia herself. Keep your soul in peace and accept with thanksgiving and real gratitude the little thorns of the womb. I owe to my neighbor love, forbearance, and forgiveness. Generosity, generosity, and generosity must be the beginning and end of our life. These are things that need to be articulated on a regular basis. If we're going to change enterprise and business, we have to actually change and articulate the values and virtues by which we live, much less work. And then, of course, we get to the heart of what Cornelia gets to, is actions, not words. I mean, everything I just said above that she quoted doesn't mean anything unless you put it in action. And finally, what she said that gets at purpose, meeting the wants of the age. And that's really what we do in our own lives and what businesses and enterprises of any sort should be doing. So those, I think, are important, that if we can get in touch with what really our shared values and virtues are for our life, then perhaps we can institutionalize them more into the world of work and business.
Well, thank you so much. It's very interesting how, we had that framework of Nestle Corporation taking, needing something for their profit making and creating a shared value system where they had a profit-making stream while they created value for a part of the country that had been suffering with social challenges and in poverty and productivity in their farming community. I really loved the way Anne took that and drew a correlation with how, it really boils down to businesses looking at what they're doing and how it's working, and really looking at very different ways that they can create shared value, create better outcomes in a variety of ways. And then, of course, John taking that and sharing that there's a blueprint for that. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Yes, we do need to examine our practices, look at things very differently, and we have this blueprint in religious thought and religious orders. So thank you for that, and you've inspired me to ask another question then that may keep this conversation going. And it has to do with something that was a headline article on the Harvard Business Review, coming up again, March 16th. And that was by Richard Straub. He's an international thought leader in management, and he enjoyed a 32-year career at IBM. And I think the title of that article, which was just 2 weeks ago, Harvard Business Review, Social Responsibility or Corporate Social Responsibility will never work unless it becomes a movement, was the title of the article. And in it, Straub says, we see a variety of small fires, but what we need to make the real progress, the progress that we need to see with helping society with our challenges across the globe, is a movement not unlike things like women's suffrage, civil rights, where certainly on those two fronts, for many, many years, there have been small fires, and while certainly the ideal vision for either of those has not yet been realized, but certainly there was a movement that created a new normal for the way society looked at things like civil rights or women voting at one point in time. And Straub says the next big movement we need is one where there is no division between, corporations, profit-making side and social responsibility side, where there wouldn't even be a need for something like a community relations department, because the very purpose of the corporation is not only to make profits, but to make the community, make society better. And I ask you, I guess, panelists, with this idea of a movement, what would you think might need to be a catalyst to go from these small fires burning, as Straub puts it, to something that produces a new normal for social responsibility, corporate social responsibility?
I love this question. I think it's a great one. I think that, my background, I went to Brown and I studied English and American literature. And so I come at the world of sustainability from the perspective of someone who loves to read and loves to think in stories and speak in stories. And one of the things that I have learned over the years is that storytelling, narrative, metaphor, that these are powerful ways to engage people in having an experience, an emotional experience that drives them to action. And that if we're going to create movements, we need to, there's move in that word movement, right? You need to actually spark action and behavior change. We talked in my breakout session a little bit about this, that it is imperative that you inspire people to not just gather information and to know, but to move. And I think there's a lot of a need for creativity, for the arts, for storytelling. So when Bart was talking about the work that B Corp does, they shine a light, and they shine a light and tell a story of examples of companies that have thought this through, have imagined it, and have created it. And once we know something and we can imagine ourselves in that person's shoes, or we can imagine how would that reflect in my business or my school or my enterprise? Once you can imagine it, you can actually make it happen. But that pausing for a moment and to imagine, I think, is critical. The other thing I would say is, we talked earlier about generational expectations. I think that this generation, for the students in the room, you have unbelievable power. And I remember when I was a student, and people would say, like, your voice is so important, and I would think, I'm only, 20, what do I have to say that someone will care about? But it is amazing what adults will do when a young person asks. And this, in my work, we make sure that students are at the front. Because an adult is willing to change, they're willing to go through the pain of going through that B Corp assessment, which is so difficult. If a young employee or a student, an intern, a young person, or anyone who's inquiring who has that fresh outlook says, this matters, we care about this, we want to work for a company that has purpose. One little anecdote I'll tell, and I'll pass the microphone, is that I remember hearing about a class that was graduating from Columbia Business School, and there had been a discussion amongst the seniors who were going through all of this intensive interview process, and they said, what about if we all kind of banded together and we asked specific questions in these interviews? And what should be the questions that we ask that would drive these companies to behave in different ways? So the white men asked about parental leave. They asked about diversity and inclusion. So they basically said, so then another population said, we care about your record on sustainability and environmental issues. So they influenced through this important moment, and a company wants to hire those Columbia Business School grads, right? So I thought that was really an interesting recognition of the power that you have to make change, even by asking questions as a young person, or really at any juncture in your career or in your life.
I'll try to be quick. Okay, I'm going to ask a question here. How many folks in here are students and in the business school or focusing on business, that kind of stuff? Okay, all in the back. I wonder why. Okay, I'm just going to throw out my closing words of advice. If you're a business school major, please take English, sociology, accounting, philosophy, theology, courses that make you think and learn how to write and be empathetic to others. Now we'll flip it the other way. How many are majors in the ones that I just mentioned in the liberal arts school? Well, we have one in the front, yay, and a couple in the back. I'm also encouraging you guys to take an accounting course. Start there. It's the hardest one. People hate it. Take it anyway. I can't stand it. Fantastic though. Take accounting, marketing, finance. I think what's very, very important is that we end up with two camps, largely because our whole educational system has two camps. And really what we need to do is achieve integration of purpose so that we have balance in both the vocational stuff of business and the real live work stuff of human relations dynamic, greater good and purpose. So please, if you're still at Rosemont, you have plenty of opportunity to do that. Take as many courses as you possibly can.
I wholeheartedly agree. My training's in philosophy. I teach in a business school. You need both sets of skills, and the students need to see that. These things, the point of an education like this, at a school that emphasizes the liberal arts, is so that you can understand things beyond just the narrow focus of business. So if you're in the business school here, definitely take courses. You know you have to. But take them with enjoyment. And I agree. All of you are going to be working somewhere. And you've got to know how organizations work. So accounting, yes, management too.
That's so wonderful. Thank you so much to our speakers for Okay, so at this point, what we'd like to do is, again, thank you so much for these wonderful words of advice, and to the students in the room, no pressure, but you now have you know what you need to do. Hope you took good notes, because you can change the idea of corporate social responsibility. And with that, I would like to open it up to questions in the audience.
It's not exactly a question, but I am a graduate from here in Rosemont, class of 07, and I had a degree in philosophy, and I had no idea what I was going to do with it, but I had a full scholarship and I loved it, so I did it. Fast forward, I got married, had kids, needed a job, and I landed up at a financial place. Then I went through a divorce, so I was like, all right, well, I need more education, so I got an MBA. And now I work for Farm Credit, and I love my job, but really having, this is more to the students here, do those cross studies, because when you can relate to people, and you can understand people, and understand culture and society and business, it's all interconnected. So anybody who tells you it's separate, or if they tell you a philosophy degree is a fake degree, first smack them. And second of all, just, make sure people understand you really know how to think. And that's a rare commodity these days.
So to follow on that, I used to go to open houses at St. Joe's, and the students, the prospective students never asked this, but the parents, they asked it. And I was standing at a philosophy table. What good is that, they would ask. And my answer is that it prepares you for nothing in particular, but absolutely everything.
Thank you so much. Any other questions from the audience before we adjourn for the day? Hi.
It's not so much a question as something we should think about is how do the businesses educate the consumers on the effects of their purchases? So how do you become I have clients who are B Corps, so there is going to be a slightly increased cost to providing some of those products. So how do you explain to the consumer why it is so much better to support that company than to buy that product for $1 less from Amazon? And the effects that has on your school, on your roads, on the cost of living, and the sustainability of the everyday person in your neighborhood. So we have a lot of words, and I've been writing them all down, but we have no succinct language yet. Just like the recycle movement never had a succinct language, but it's what we use recycle. Everybody here can say it, and everybody here knows what it means. So how do we get that language out to the world to help people understand that that extra 50 cents or that extra dollar is an amazing contribution to your community?
My colleague from the Uruguay Center, David Steingart, is here, and he'll affirm this next statement. I tend not to be an optimist, but in this case, I think, at least generationally, we don't need to explain. This is something that those who are substantially younger than us have as, I think, part of their DNA. There is a sense of, at least among many students that I see, a sense of commitment to thinking about where your products come from. What's the supply chain like? Have they been produced in humane ways? Are they environmentally friendly? And there's this demand for purpose in one's work. So I think there's been a kind of generational shift, and employers are reporting that too, I think. And Ann's point earlier makes that as well. So I think to at least a portion of our population, we don't have to explain it, they believe it.
Yeah, I also point to, I think there's campaigns that have been created that have been really effective, like Buy Local. I think
those, I would like to. That's a command. Buy local. How do you explain to somebody what the reason behind that is?
The philosophy.
Yes,
yeah.
Very succinct.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think if you dive into Buy Local and examine it at all and ask why, then the campaigns usually do have some sort of embedded information about how every dollar invested in a local community purchased in a local community yields greater benefits for that social community than a dollar answer to that, but I think that the more we actually have conversation and the more, again, we tell stories about it and we start to talk about it in metaphor and understand and communicate in ways that reach all audiences, like we'll find our way to the language. I think, you know, when we hit the year 2000, we were all sort of like, what are we going to call this? Like, we're going to call it ought or not, or, you know, it's like we didn't have a name for it yet, and then a few years later, we were like, it's the year 2000. You know, like, we all were like, we're not going to call anything else. So I think there's a little bit of that, like it's still new for us. We're still kind of trying different things on and seeing what fits, but we'll find our way there. But what matters is that we actually talk about it, and then we'll find the terms and the stories that fit and that resonate.
In the long run, it may not matter, and I can just speak from my experiences. We run a contact center business. Our revenues last year were $30 million. Most of my employees, about almost 80% of them, are people with disabilities. Guess what? We don't sell disability. We just sell the contact center services, and we're better than anybody else. And so I'm hoping that in the long run, the market will take care of this because we've educated the market in such a way to value the common good.
Thank you so much. I just have one last question. I don't think anything is going to change until the true cost of doing things in an unsustainable manner is part of the business model. I don't think people are going to willingly pay more if you tell them it's better for the community. I think the bottom line is how much it costs. So if the true cost, for example, the first thing that's coming to my mind is shade-grown coffee versus plantation and sun-grown coffee. Shade-grown coffee that's certified is very expensive. Nobody's going to buy it. Of course it's better for the community. But no one's going to buy it because it's more expensive. So if the true cost of growing coffee out in the sun, in plantations, fertilizer intensive, reducing the biodiversity, if all that were put into the cost of that coffee, then people would buy shade-grown coffee because it's cheaper.
Thank you so much. What's really exciting is the amount of interest we have. We even have students in the back with their hands up right now. And we've run out of time, so I'm going to defer to our leader, Dr. Preddy, to see what we should do.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists, to Professor Hayward for moderating the panel, to our sponsors, and to you all for spending the morning with us today. I do want to ask you again if you'll take a few minutes to complete the survey that was distributed and handed into the registration table on your way out. Your feedback is extremely important to us concerning our events and planning for future events. And I do want to mention that our theme for next year's symposium is anticipatory ethics. And anticipatory ethics is a wide-ranging field that treats of ethical issues that emerge as a result of new technologies, such as drone warfare, nanotechnology, autonomous vehicles, virtual reality, just to name a few. The issues are many and are becoming increasingly complex as technological achievements in these and other areas expand rapidly. So please stay in touch with our work through our Facebook page, through our website, and we hope to see you again next year. And I would like President Hirsch to have the final word today. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to share one thing and recognize somebody who's here. Rosemont College belongs to a consortium of 8 local Philadelphia colleges. They're called SEPCHE, which stands for Southeastern Pennsylvania Consortium for Higher Education. I'm pleased to recognize our Executive Director, Beth Moy, who has been here for the entire morning, and also to recognize her ability to get us grants as a consortium. Right now, Rosemont is working with an excellent Teagle Foundation grant, and it is specifically to merge the business programs with the liberal arts. So we have Colonel Tim Ringgold here. He's the chair of the business program, and he's been working with one of our language professors to introduce more liberal arts background into our business programs. Beth, thank you. And thank you all for being here. It's been a great morning. Thank you.
something after this discussion.
I just like to comment. I guess that's kind of what I was like having words. I wasn't sure what the cost is.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless somebody changes the accounting rules, they should have to. And I'm really upset because our students had their hands up. So that requires. I'm sorry I couldn't.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. No.
We had to end it.
Yeah, it's okay.
What was your question?
I was wondering. I mean, I think one of the most important duties is for companies to try to keep jobs here. For example, like how the Rust Belt got decimated. Like
these are good things. We should try to talk about these in class.
Okay.
Yes. I am what we are. Exactly. I'm willing to pay more.
But I can like I listen to my right. They're always talking about the deal. Right. Exactly. But it's not about the deal. What's your deal?
Exactly. Right. That has to be yeah. That's what the cost. We're not paying for we're not paying I think it's a huge part of it. You know, like government data, cost of different countries. Quality of life is hard. You know, like cost of certified quality of life is better than how do we even measure that? You know, how do you they've been talking about hard. What is the cost of copying? Good job. Yeah, right. And for president. Right. Some things are easier, you know, like the amount of fertilizer you don't have to use, for example.
Sure, but what's the effect of fertilizer based on the line for the water supply?
Right, those things are they're hard, but not as hard as the happiness quotient. Never get like that one. But I feel like the community and the quality of life.
Anyway, this is just
well, thank you. You were the one that got me. Well, actually, I thought about that early on when they started talking. And after you said that, so I just have to.
How do you tell people what the cost is? And if you can't put it into money, how do you put it to work?
Yeah, exactly.
And if we can't put it to work, Chad, no money.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Charles, the driver. Well, that's funny. Did you think he was going to do it? That'd be good. That's okay. Let me talk with him. You're going to keep it in your room, and I'm going to meet you. Oh, I will. Well, I think you there. I'm trying to get some Dunkin' Donuts. Get on the van. I have many more.
Yes, I do.
Temperance, Mary Grace's.
I'm just putting this in there. Not bad. I'm all like beneath. Yep. Yeah, you do.
It's like a whole
connect with
week.
people. We have an idea that, family business programs. We can find We go back to work. We want to come to work.
I'm so very proud. Very proud. Nice to meet you. Very proud of her.
I took over as executive director from
Like her.
When I was not one of the
While we're away.
good friends with all
This is her second home. Yes. I just thank you for the love. And thank you for the love. It's been a great experience going on.
It sounds good.
Tomorrow.
In this town, it has incredible.
Yeah,
well, you see,
do you have more classes this afternoon? Oh, no, I'm done. You're done. I actually don't have one.
Recently, I've done this getting arrested.
I don't know how this is. The guys get much better schedules than I do. Hey, class, it was very nice to meet you.
I instituted a word called getting work. And that's what happened. Word from Alan.
Oh, here.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, right. I'll meet you. I don't know.
This is all
Are you going back to the cars?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll meet you.
Okay.
Everything's done, so.
Okay. Hi.
So Untours was a business founded by tours across the Caribbean,
To see so many businesses.
in a way that
Oh, yes. Here, oh, yes.
That was great. So
Inspirational.
but how
Wonderful. That's what we want.
She makes it real.
Yeah.
Get microfinancing.
Glad you enjoyed it. Welcome back for all the future things.
Well, some of them got saved.
There's a schedule of events on our webpage.
Good. Yeah, you too. And we'll stay in touch about, Oh, yeah, thank you for everything.
Oh, it's great.
I mean, yeah, you know, when my wife. I always dump that on the side because I always use Kitty Jen B's case. Everybody else thought somebody else was going to do something. So I always, when I spend any time on it, I always say, don't pay attention. No.